Well, welcome to the podcast today. My name is Jeff and I am your host. And you may notice that I'm not in my usual place. We are recording today from Jerusalem, Israel, and it's wonderful to be able to bring you this backdrop today. My guest today is Andrew Tucker, director of the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. And he is a graduate of the universities of Melbourne and Oxford. Andrew Tucker has over 20 years of experience as an attorney in Australia, the UK, and the Netherlands. And from 2004 to 2018, he served as executive director of Christians for Israel International. He currently serves as editor-in-chief of the global publication Israel and Christians Today. In 2017, he co-founded the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, a network of experts in the fields of international law, history, and religion. Thinc challenge the misuse of international law to delegitimize the state of Israel. Andrew lives in the Netherlands with his wife and 4 children and 1 dog. Andrew, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks, Jeff. So nice to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you, and we are just getting to know each other a little bit. And so I wanted to just have you in the beginning tell us a bit about the journey that brought you to co-found Thinc, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. What's your story?
Yeah, well, it's a long one. I'll try and give you the short version, but I've come a long way. You know, I grew up in Australia as a lawyer in a Christian environment, Christian family, and I always had a passion for Europe. I've had a passion for understanding the Jewish people and Israel. So my career took me to the UK, and from the UK, I met my wife, who is Dutch, and moved to the Netherlands 30 years ago. Now, so I've been working as an international lawyer in a fairly commercial kind of environment, but the Lord was kind of tugging a little bit at me, and I've always wanted to be in the space of the relationship of nations with Israel. And this is what fascinates me as a lawyer, but also as a Christian, is understanding this amazing return of the Jewish people to the land and this phenomenon of the modern state of Israel, which, as you know better than I do, is such a fascinating story and such a complex one. Now, I didn't know an awful lot about Israel, to be quite honest with you. I knew a lot of Jewish people and I knew a lot of Holocaust survivors, but I didn't know much about the modern state of Israel until I started working with Christians for Israel, traveling to Israel, and just deepening my understanding of the realities of the modern state of Israel. And that led me really to start to think about, well, what is this all about, this international law thing? You know, everybody's criticizing Israel the whole time. We hear all the time about how the settlements are illegal. We hear about how Israel's an apartheid state. This is the latest kind of challenge. We really hear, and especially here in Europe, Jeff, is about actually Israel is the problem. And so really the last 15 years I've been researching and writing and starting to speak about these issues, because I think that as Christians we've been misled. Badly misled by the media, by our own churches, who are by and large ignorant, but they use the language of law to criticize Israel. We've been misled by the legal community, and I think it's time for us to re-understand what is actually happening. And part of that story is about the way legal language is used to justify political or even religious positions. So that's why I find law is so fascinating, because law is really kind of language. It's a language that we use to actually explain what are more moral or political positions than legal ones. It suits us to use the language of law. So I think there's a lot going on in the background, and my role, if you like, my calling and even my ministry is to help. I think help Christians to unpack all of these issues, to help Christians to understand this, that Israel's not perfect by any means. The Jewish people are certainly not perfect, but nor am I, nor is the church. And there's a complexity here which I think we need to understand and unravel, because God's doing an incredible thing, and we're missing it. We're missing it because of all of the extraneous messaging that we're getting, unfortunately.
Right. Fascinating. And just in case you're wondering, I'm not perfect either.
Oh, good to know.
We do our best, but of course we're not.
Yeah.
And I love to hear what you're saying. And so understanding all of those things and needing to use the language of law to kind of unpack some of this. Tell us, what is thinc exactly? What's your mission as an organization?
So we are a network. We started out a little over 5 years ago. You might remember there was a UN Security Council resolution at the end of 2016, just before Trump took on the presidency. It was Obama and Kerry's last international effort to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. It was Resolution 2334. And that's the only time the Security Council has come out saying that settlements are illegal, a flagrant violation of international law. Now, that was building on decades of legal discourse. There was a 2004 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which also talked about settlements being illegal, and the security barrier in Jerusalem and in Israel is preventing the Palestinians from achieving their right to self-determination, and so on. So I called a bunch of international lawyers together to meet in the Peace Palace in The Hague to look at this and think, well, what is actually happening here? Is it true that it's illegal for Jewish people to live in the old city of Jerusalem? Is this really what international law says? Is it illegal by definition for a Jew to live in Hebron or Shiloh or Bethlehem? How did we get to the position where, as an international community, we said 100 years ago the Jews were allowed to return home, and now we're telling ourselves that it's illegal for them to live outside this little ghetto that we've created for them? So we sat down and we started this process, and the vision is a global network of lawyers who are wrestling with these issues and trying to counter this narrative about the delegitimization of Israel, because that's what's happening through ignorance, but also there is a strategy of those who are the enemies of Israel to delegitimize Israel. Now, it's the only state in the world which is being, apart from South Africa, we had, getting rid of apartheid in South Africa. Now the big effort is get rid of the Jewish state of Israel. And it's time for a network for international lawyers to stand up and say, this is ridiculous. We are turning international law on its head here. And so the role of thinc is to be this network and to counter the delegitimization of Israel and explain why it's a problem and what the alternative is.
Talk a little bit about why this should be such a huge concern to Christians, or at least, to those of us who care about the peace of Jerusalem.
Okay, so just to back up a little bit, we've had this sort of series of UN resolutions. The UN is a very political organization, right? It was set up in the end of the Second World War with brilliant ideals, very important, peace and security, friendly relations between nations, and so forth. But it's become a political environment where the Soviets, the Arab world, the Islamic world have been able to form majorities to condemn Israel and the Jewish people time and time again. One of the latest is the creation of this commission of inquiry by the Human Rights Council based in Geneva. It's a UN body to set up yet another commission. We've had many of them, and this is the latest one, but this one is a permanent one, and it's extremely well funded. They get $5 million a year to have a staff of 20 people who are only investigating Israel's crimes. Now, formally, they're supposed to investigate Hamas as well, but we know that they're only getting information from one side. So it's really set up to be a kind of a star chamber to build a case, a criminal case against Israel. That's in the mandate, so that this information can be fed into the International Criminal Court. So the criminal court can take proceedings against Israeli leaders who have allegedly committed war crimes. And what is the war crime? The crimes are, first of all, allowing Jews to live outside the Green Line. Okay, so I don't know where you're sitting in Jerusalem, Jeff, but if you're sitting outside the Green Line and you're Jewish, then you're doing that illegally. So that is a war crime according to the International Criminal Court, is the so-called settlements in occupied Palestinian territories. And another war crime is the crime of apartheid. And this is also what the Commission will be investigating, is whether the Jewish state is inherently discriminating against and oppressing the Palestinians. That's what this commission is doing. Now, I think this is terribly important because it's another tool, if you like, it's another weapon in the hands of the enemies of Israel. Now, on the one hand, we could say, well, it's all politics. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, God will look after Israel. And I think that's true. But on the other hand, I think as Christians, we have a responsibility also towards our nations to make sure our nations are acting in the right way towards Israel. So, I'm based here in the Netherlands, but I'm also Australian. So I'm concerned that my government, Australian government, also the Dutch government, are taking a righteous attitude towards Israel. And unfortunately, our governments have been tolerating this kind of, criticizing and condemning Israel. They sit on the fence. They don't really dare to stop it happening. And that's why we're trying to lobby, to advocate for the dismantling of this commission, because we think it's a one-sided demonization of the state of Israel. There's nothing wrong with investigating Israel, criticizing it. And I'm not saying that everything Israel does towards the Palestinians is right, but to say that Israel is an illegal state by definition, and this idea of the occupation being illegal, I think is highly problematic.
To me, listening to you talk, I mean, they start with the presupposition that Israel is committing crimes. What sort of inquisition or investigation starts with that presupposition? I mean, there's if and I have to be careful. We are a Canadian charity. We're very careful not to be vocally political. But I'm asking maybe a logical question. If there's something that's going to be investigated, everything that I understand about justice starts with innocent till proven guilty. Whether you're Israeli or Palestinian or whoever
Yeah.
you are, the investigation, I think, should be based on that thinking until such time as evidence is uncovered that that says otherwise. So how can they begin with that presupposition?
Well, I think it's got to do a little bit with the complexity. There's always been like, um, it's always been a bit unclear what is the state of Israel really based on? You know, states come into existence and we tend not to question, we don't go around endlessly questioning whether Canada exists or not, or whether Australia exists or not, or whether its borders, we accept all of that. Now, that's not the case with Israel. There's always been this idea that allowing the Jews to come from the diaspora with an automatic right to live in the land when 100 years ago they were in the minority, to give them this right to recreate their homeland, which is unique in world history, let's face it. There's been nothing like it. So it doesn't fit easily into our legal framework. And from the very beginning, the Arab world was opposed to it. Right from the beginning, the political leadership in the Arab world refused to accept the idea of Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. Now, Israel was created, as you know, through war, through conflict. It happened despite the opposition, despite the Holocaust, despite the UN being barely interested in helping the Jewish people. It came into existence in 1948. But the question remains, how legitimate is it? And I think that question has still been on our minds. It's been on the agenda of the UN ever since 1948. The UN has had this idea it has to solve the Palestinian problem. And the Palestinian problem is the fact that the Palestinians don't have their own state. That's the problem the UN feels it has to resolve. So they start with this question about, well, is Israel legitimate? They're starting with a starting point of questioning the legality of Israel, the borders of Israel. Everything's up for grabs. And I think that's why we have these endless inquiries, because nobody's been able to give a satisfactory, clear, comprehensive, definitive answer to it. And Israel hasn't. Actually, Israel's not been very good in explaining itself, in defending itself. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's been ambiguous, I think. And that's got a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that within the Jewish world, there are so many opinions and so many views, of the left to right, from orthodox to liberal, so it's very hard for them to speak with one voice. You see it in the politics of Israel today. And we've not been good at it as Christians, have we? We've not been good at explaining. And then the whole legal thing is complicated. So I think that's why they start with questioning, with having a kind of assumption that there might be something illegal about Israel. And then when it came to take territory in 1967, the Arabs had a majority in the UN which said, no, this is illegal. This is occupation. Occupation is illegal, they say. So that's why this commission starts with that assumption, unfortunately.
Wow. Well, like I said, I try not to get too political. I'm a Bible believing Christian who believes that Israel has a right to be in their land because God said it would happen. We are seeing and have been seeing since 1948, in my humble opinion, the fulfillment of prophecy from Ezekiel 36 and 37 and many other parts of Scripture, which I know doesn't hold water in a court of law, but there's something bigger at work here, and I'm not. I know I'm not. Uh, Trying to convince you, maybe preaching to the choir in some ways, but I guess it's great to see someone coming at it from the angle of law, so that it can help us to sort of work these things out as a our world. I mean, people looking in from the outside, certainly. I don't live here in Israel, but I come here often, and as you have in the past as well. And what I see here is not what is described in the media, or even in the United Nations. I mean, I don't see evidence of apartheid. I know that there's Arab nations where there are zero Jews living, or very very small numbers, and that Jews fled from those places when Israel was established, because the Arab world kicked them all out. But I don't see any evidence of apartheid here. I rub shoulders with Arabs in the market here in Jerusalem anytime that I go. And they all seem fairly happy to be here.
Mm.
The ones that are Israeli citizens. So I'm going to be careful, because I don't want to get political again. But it is a real problem. Let me ask you this: anti-Semitism, it's on the rise all around the world, and there are many factors for that. We don't want to get into all of them, but with the rise of anti-Semitism in the world today, how is this subject that we're talking about impacted by that, do you believe, and how does it contribute?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jeff, and I suppose a complicated one. What is anti-Semitism? I suppose it's a kind of inherent hatred or opposition to the Jewish people. I think it's largely driven by ignorance. I think it's deeply impacting this issue, because there's a kind of a sense, an unspoken sense, often unexpressed, not articulated, but we just don't like the idea of the Jews having sovereignty over something, do we? And you see it in the attitude of the churches. Unfortunately, the established churches come out time and again with this thing, that Jerusalem should be the capital of an Arab state, that Israel should be supporting a two-state policy, they should be withdrawing from the West Bank, and so forth. And they do it. I think anti-Semitism is at the root of that, because we've not accepted that God's sovereignty, we've not accepted that He is doing this work. As you so rightly said, it's God who's bringing these people back. And I think somehow that offends us, doesn't it? We don't like the idea that God is somehow sovereign and does things that we're not in control of, and that we didn't decide. And so, to my mind, this is kind of at the root of our opposition to Jewish sovereignty. But as you say, the reality is actually it's such a blessing to the Jew and the non-Jew in the land, isn't it? This restoration of Israel. God, in His wisdom, He wants to bless the Palestinians and the Arabs. He doesn't want to get rid of them. He wants the Jewish people to be a blessing to them, that they live together in the land, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, and you mentioned, we talk about anti-Semitism. There's also this growing movement that is anti-God, that does not recognize the sovereignty of God, that doesn't recognize moral absolution or truth as an absolute. All of these things, I think, are having an impact, as you say. But I believe, like you, that this state, this place where I'm sitting in West Jerusalem, the Jewish part of Jerusalem, and this land of Israel, is truly a blessing, not just to the people who live here, but to the rest of the world. And there is, I'm not very smart when it comes to law, and so I don't understand all the ins and outs of the legal aspects of this. But what I observe from here and from watching what is happening from afar, I observe that there is a people, the Palestinian people, who are um, they're being persecuted by their own leadership more than they're being persecuted by Israel, in my estimation. And the fact that the Palestinian agenda, the agenda of Hamas and of other factions that hate Israel, that don't want Israel to exist, and have actually stated so in their, in their legal documents, in their. I'm looking for a word that I can't find right now. Basically what
The
their um,
constitutions.
what their
Yeah,
ideology, yeah, what their ideology is based on, their constitutions. They've stated
yeah.
these things. Why is that not a concern to the United Nations and to sort of the political powers that be? I think that there's something
Yeah,
missing here in this
yeah,
conversation.
yeah. It's fascinating to think about that, isn't it? I think in the West, the Western world, our Western mindset, which comes from a Judeo-Christian background, we're in the minority in the United Nations. There are almost 200 member states of the UN. Well, over a quarter of them are Islamic states. Okay, and then half of them are members of the non-aligned movement. They're not Islamic states, but they're opposed to Western ideology. It's half of South America. It's half of the African world. They've gone with the Soviet communist Marxist ideology. So they've formed this majority in the UN. So they're not interested in uh, a Western democratic state in the Middle East. That's just not where they're coming from. It's not in their interest. And then I think in the West we've lost our ability to articulate why it's important that we have these values. Why is Israel significant and important? Um, so that's why I think in the UN it seems to be going wrong, and we tend to um, bow down to the political realities of power politics. I mean, just look at Europe. Europe's supposed to be Christian, at least it was once Christian, but politically it's in a very difficult position. For decades, it's been dependent upon Arab oil. Well, that means Europe has adjusted its politics to fit in with what the Arabs think is important, and that's resulted in their pro-Arab policies relating to Israel, unfortunately. And then yeah, and then I think law just comes in as a kind of a way to justify those positions. We've done a study which we'll shortly publish about how the European two-state policy came into being. And if you look at the politics of the 1970s and 1980s, it's all about Europe losing its Judeo-Christian identity and conforming itself to what it thinks is it's trying to get a position in the world that makes it important. And then Israel is the sacrifice, really, I think. It's the meat in the sandwich between the West and the rest.
How ironic is it or is it safe to say that it's quite ironic that that international law, which was really so influenced by the Hebrew Bible and by Judaism, that now this sort of flip flop is happening in this
Look,
discussion.
you hit the nail right on the head, Jeff. You're absolutely right. 100 years ago, the international community, before or at the end of the First World War, got together and said, you know what? Justice is achieved by allowing the Jewish people to return to their homeland. That was the Balfour Declaration and the mandate for Palestine. It was an international decision. There was a treaty. You know, all the 51 member states of the League of Nations made that decision. And now, 100 years later, they're doing exactly the opposite. But, you know, I think biblically, this is exactly what can be expected is, you know, we know that there is this going to be this clash between the nations and God, basically. And it's all got to do with Israel, because the nations, and international law is just the law of nations, isn't it? It's just the law that nations create. So if the nations decide
Right.
that the world is flat, then that becomes international law, even though it's not true. So this is the problem. And it's got to do, I think, with the nations not accepting God's sovereign choice of his people, his land. And, you know, the prophecies of the Old Testament are full of the predictions of the nations coming up against Jerusalem, aren't they? Zechariah, Joel, there's going to be the nations against Jerusalem. So why do the nations care about Jerusalem? I mean, why should they care about this piddly little city which is so insignificant? Surely New York is more important, or London, or Paris, but no, it's Jerusalem, and it's got to do with that's the place where God is fulfilling his purposes, and we don't like it as nations. We don't like it. So we're going to use international law as a justification for coming up against Jerusalem to get rid of the Jews, to defeat what God is doing. So that's why I think we are really living in this moment of time. You know, for me, it's not about international law. But it's more about, you know, what is really happening is that we are opposing as nations, and unfortunately, I think as institutional churches, we are opposing this incredibly beautiful thing that God is doing of restoring his people, exactly where you're sitting, and you see that reality around you, don't you? Of the children playing on the streets, Arabs and Jews together. That is the reality, and that will be the reality.
And I would add here, Andrew, that the only time we see that disrupted is when terror attacks, like have been happening here in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv and in other places in recent weeks, are perpetrated against the
Yeah,
Jewish people here. Otherwise, this is a safe and
yeah,
peaceful place. It's a
yeah,
wonderful place to be, and so it really
yeah,
is troubling to me that this is such a one-sided
yeah.
conversation. And I maybe just tell our listeners and those who are watching, why, as Christians especially, should we be concerned with all of this, with the Israel-Palestinian conflict and the one-sidedness of this conversation?
Look, I think it's got to do with aligning ourselves with God's purposes. And of course, God is doing many things. He's not just, involved with Israel. He's working everywhere, in every place through his Holy Spirit. And Jesus came to save not just Israel, but the whole world, to redeem the whole world. But I think the Israel thing, is key and critical for maybe two reasons. One is understanding the big picture. You know, as we've unfortunately as Christians, we've been, I think, misled by this theology of salvation that, you know, the only thing that matters is whether I'm saved and go to heaven, right? It's about me and my salvation. Well, actually, God's plan is bigger than that. It's about establishing his kingdom on earth, his heavenly kingdom on earth. And it's about more than my salvation or your salvation. It's got to do with the nations. It's got to do with the Jewish people, because when Jesus comes, he's not going to destroy the earth. He's going to establish his kingdom on earth. And he comes as king of Israel. You know, the angel Gabriel said to Mary, prophesying about Jesus, that he would sit on the throne of his father David in Jerusalem in the midst of Jacob. Well, what's that? That's Jesus hasn't done that yet. He has not reigned on the throne of his father David in Jerusalem in the midst of his own people, has he? This is something that has to be fulfilled. So that's the first point, I think, is Israel helps us understand the big picture. And then secondly, I think it helps us understand where we are in God's timetable. And that is, we're right at the end of this phase, not the end of world history, not the end of history, but the end of this phase of history. And that means Jesus is coming soon. So I think as our calling as a church is, as Christians individually, but as corporately as a church, is to be a witness of God's purposes. And if our message to the world is the Jews in East Jerusalem is illegal, or, you know, this whole Israel thing is a mistake, that's not a very good witness. Our witness should be Israel is in existence. It's not perfect. The Jews are not perfect, but they're coming home to their homeland. They're building something beautiful. Let's support them. Let's get involved in this and do something important. And it is being, and it will be a blessing to everybody. That's why I think it's so important that we as Christians, it's not about politics. It's not about, you know, getting political about it. It's just about, you know, for me, the bottom line is just saying, look, the Jews have a right to existence. They have a right to national existence in the land. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be two states, or I'm not saying where boundaries should be, whatever. But they're legitimate. They have a right to live as a nation and to be who God has called them to be. And that is a light to the nations and a blessing to the nations. If we don't understand that as Christians, I think we've missed half of the gospel. I think we've missed half of the Bible. So that's why I think this is a really, really important issue for Christians today to wrestle with, to get their heads around, and to try and take a reasonable and a responsible position in this.
Yeah. Andrew, thank you. Those are powerful words. And I appreciate you taking the time to articulate that. Now, Isaiah 62 talks about, you know, watchmen on the walls of Jerusalem. Do you consider yourself one of those?
I think so. You know, I think
Yeah.
we're all called. I think we're all called to be that wherever we are. You know, Jerusalem is symbolic, isn't it? It's literal. There's the literal Jerusalem. So in a way, I have the privilege of, I think, defending the literal Jerusalem. But there's a deeper thing too, isn't there? It's about, because Jerusalem, I think, is significant because it represents the heart of God. You know, Zion. So whether you're a Christian in Miami or Buenos Aires or Sydney, I think you can be a watchman on the wall of Jerusalem. Um, I have the opportunity to do it in my field of work, which I think is relevant. But I think the call of Isaiah 62 is a call to the whole body of Christ to be this wall around Jerusalem, defending, supporting the Jewish people. And a watchman looks, doesn't he? A watchman is looking to the outside world to see the dangers, to see the threats, to identify itself with the city that it's watching. And I think this really goes to the heart of our identity today.
Absolutely, and I use this text often, and I tell believers wherever I go, I tell them, listen, Isaiah 62, 6 and 7 says that we're to be watchmen on the walls, and it says that we should give ourselves no rest and give God no rest until he establishes Jerusalem and makes her the praise of the earth. And I say to them, listen, if it says you who call on the Lord, so if you're someone who prays, then there is something that God says that we should be praying about. We should be doing that consistently and persistently to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and that God will fulfill his purposes here in the physical land of Israel, but also in the people of Israel, the Jewish people. It really is a clarion call, I believe, to the entire church. And so I appreciate you sharing with us today, Andrew. Thank you so much for being with us. These have been just incredible things that you've helped us, I think, to understand a little better. And I want to just say, I wish you all the best in your work. We will be praying for you also as you continue this important work that you're doing. Now, if someone from our audience wants to reach out to you to learn more about what it is you're doing, can you tell them where they can go to find out about that?
Yeah. So we have a website, obviously, thinc.info, THINC.info. That's kind of a place where you can find us. And, we want to be a service to the church. We have a role, advocating and speaking to the public space. That's part of what we do. But part of what we do is we want to be of service to Christians around the world. So I really encourage Christians, if you want to understand more about this, come to our website. We're starting to develop different courses, which we'll be offering at different levels for people to dig deeper into the things we've been talking about in this podcast. So if you visit our site, you'll find more information about those as you go along, and sign up for our newsletter. Because when you do that, we can inform you about events, educational programs, and keep you informed about the legal issues going forward. So visit us at www.thinc.info and sign up for our newsletter and support us in any way that you can. We'd be really, really grateful, because we need also the financial support of Christians from around the world to make this possible, to do what we're doing. I think we're the only Christian organization doing this work, at least in this way, of being an educational platform to help people understand what is going on. So thank you for the opportunity, Jeff, to speak about it. Thank you for the opportunity to share our work, and I hope we can be a service to you and to your listeners.
Well, it's our pleasure to have had you, and we really do appreciate your time. Andrew, thanks for being our guest today. God bless you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. You can listen to this entire podcast on your favorite audio podcast platform. Find the link below. And while you're at it, don't forget to click subscribe and follow us on Facebook so you can stay connected to First Century Foundations.